You can solve almost anything. Someone calls at the wrong hour and you answer. Someone panics and you steady them. Someone needs the number, the plan, the presence, the money, the patience, and you produce it. But somewhere between the last obligation and this quiet moment, you started a sentence you have never been able to finish. Not out loud, not even privately, without the words dissolving before they land. It begins, "Honestly, I am exhausted and I don't know how much longer I can." And then something stops it. Not a person, not a threat, something quieter and more efficient than either of those. The awareness that too many people need you to be exactly who you already are. Introduction. Before a role changes what you do, it changes what you are allowed to notice. This is the part that rarely gets examined, because behavior is visible and perception is not. When someone asks whether you are managing well, the question lands inside a framework that has already decided what a satisfying answer looks like. The framework is the role. And the role is not simply a duty or a job title or a family position. It is a set of instructions about what kind of evidence counts, what kind of feeling is admissible, and what kind of thought is permitted to become a sentence. Evidence that supports the role passes through easily. It confirms what you and everyone around you already understand to be true, that you are capable, dependable, essential, steady. Evidence that threatens the role, the fatigue that does not resolve, the resentment that keeps returning, the private calculation you made last spring and then filed away. That evidence does not disappear. It gets renamed. Exhaustion becomes ingratitude. Resentment becomes something you need to manage better. Desire becomes a fantasy you cannot afford. The renaming happens quickly, often before conscious thought, and the renamed version feels more reasonable than the original. This is not weakness or dishonesty. It is what a well-installed role does automatically to protect its own continuation. This book, The Rolekeeper's Index, exists to document that process and to begin recovering what it has filed away. Over the chapters ahead, you will learn to identify which role is active and what category of evidence it typically excludes. You will examine who benefits from the role continuing unchanged and what it costs you over time, to see only the evidence the role approves. Most importantly, you will find a path between two impossible extremes: the total continuation of a role that has outgrown its original purpose, and the abandonment of people who depend on you in ways that are real. The governing question is this: what truth has become difficult to admit because too many people depend on you remaining the person they already know? Chapter 1. How a role becomes an editor. Every role of this kind begins with a real problem that genuinely needed solving. Someone had to hold the finances together, or keep the household running, or translate a complicated situation for people who were frightened, or carry more than their share during a period when no one else could. The role was not a performance. It was a response to actual conditions, and responding to those conditions required real competence, real sacrifice, and real presence. That origin matters. It means the role was not an error. It was a useful answer to a specific question. The difficulty begins with praise and reliance. When you solve a problem effectively, the people around you notice. They feel safer. They return to the same source. They describe you to others using the role as the primary noun, the one who handles things, the steady one, the person who knows, the one who will not fall apart. Praise is not malicious. Neither is reliance. Both are natural responses to demonstrated competence. But they have a structural effect. They begin to make the role feel less like something you do and more like something you are. Repetition deepens this. Each time you perform the function, each time the outcome confirms that you are good at it, the role becomes more legible as a self-description. Over months or years, you begin to answer the question, who are you? Even privately, even without an audience, in the role's vocabulary. This consolidation is not dramatic. It does not happen during a single event. It accumulates the way sediment accumulates, without announcement underneath the ordinary surface of daily life. The problem is not that you became useful. The problem is what happens when the role becomes the container for your entire sense of worth. When usefulness and identity are no longer clearly separate, anything that challenges the role feels like a challenge to your value as a person. A moment of incompetence feels like exposure. A sign of exhaustion feels like a character flaw. An admission of uncertainty feels like a collapse of the entire structure that others depend on. The threat is not external, it is now internal, and it operates at the level of what is allowed to feel true. At that point, the role begins performing a secondary function it was never consciously assigned. It begins selecting evidence, experiences and observations that confirm the role's portrait of you, capable, needed, solid, are easy to hold, easy to voice, easy to integrate. Experiences that contradict it are harder to form into words, harder to share, harder even to sustain as a private thought for longer than a moment. This is not self-deception in the ordinary sense. It is the natural consequence of making a role load-bearing for identity. When something is structural, you do not examine it casually. You work around it. The distinction that matters is the one between performing a function and being the function. A provider can stop providing in a given situation without ceasing to be a person of value. An expert can encounter a question they cannot answer without their accumulated knowledge dissolving. A caregiver can need rest without that need constituting abandonment. But when the role and the identity have fully merged, this distinction is no longer practically available. The role does not just guide action, it guides perception. And guided perception is where the real editing begins. Every role, once it becomes identity load-bearing, begins operating according to a simple and largely invisible rule. Evidence compatible with the role's self-portrait is allowed to register fully, while evidence that threatens that portrait is processed through a different channel. The compatible evidence receives attention, language, priority, and memory. The threatening evidence receives hesitation, reinterpretation, moral weight, and early disposal. Compatible evidence is easy to recognize because it feels natural rather than earned. A provider reads a confirmation that their work has protected their family and feels settled, confirmed, aligned. A caregiver hears that someone they support has improved and experiences something close to relief. An expert receives acknowledgement from a peer and finds that the acknowledgement fits easily into their existing self-description. None of this requires effort. The evidence lands where it belongs because a place has already been prepared for it. Threatening evidence travels differently. A provider notices that they feel no particular interest in continuing their career trajectory, and the observation does not settle. It generates friction. Rather than being held as information, it is held as a problem to be resolved. The resolution often comes quickly. This is just fatigue, the timing is bad. This kind of thinking is something people feel when conditions are difficult. The original observation is not exactly discarded. It is reclassified into a category that requires no response. What makes this mechanism difficult to observe from inside is the speed of the reclassification. By the time a threatening observation becomes conscious thought, the role has often already framed it. The thought arrives pre-labeled. It arrives as, "I am being ungrateful," rather than, "I am exhausted." It arrives as, "I cannot afford this kind of thinking right now," rather than, "Something in my situation has genuinely changed." The moral label replaces the behavioral observation so efficiently that the observation itself can feel irrelevant. Consider a person who has provided financial stability for a household for over a decade. They notice, not dramatically but persistently, that the career path they are on no longer matches what they care about. The observation has appeared before. Each time, it has been managed. The role-compatible version of the situation emphasizes responsibility, timing, and the genuine needs of the people who depend on their income. These factors are real. But notice what is not permitted to have equal weight: the duration of the misalignment, the evidence of its cost in physical and psychological terms, the possibility of alternatives that have not been fully examined. The role does not forbid those considerations. It simply assigns them a lower evidence rating and routes them toward indefinite deferral. A parallel process operates in caregiving. A person whose daily life is organized around the needs of someone who requires support may carry resentment, grief, fear, and desire with no sanctioned outlet. These are not signs of insufficient love or inadequate commitment. They are the natural emotional response to carrying a significant burden over an extended period. But the caregiving role has a built-in moral framework that assigns negative weight to any admission that conflicts with the portrait of selfless, patient, willing service. When the true emotional record is systematically misread as a character failure, the caregiver loses access to the information their own experience is trying to supply. The editing rule is not evidence of bad faith. It is evidence that the role has become primary, and that is precisely the condition the Rolekeeper's index is designed to make visible. Because the first step toward recovering excluded evidence is simply to recognize that the exclusion is happening, not as a personal failing, but as a mechanical consequence of how deeply the role has been installed. Chapter 2. How the plate is attached. Roles of this kind do not arrive through a formal agreement. They form during a specific kind of pressure, a period when someone had to step forward, when the alternative to assuming the role was a consequence nobody wanted, when the situation itself made the decision before deliberation was possible. A parent becomes ill. A business enters a dangerous period. A family system enters a phase of instability, and someone has to be the stabilizing element. A colleague leaves suddenly, and the remaining person absorbs the function. The role does not feel chosen in these moments. It feels required because in many cases it genuinely is. What solidifies the role during the initial crisis is the response it generates. When you hold a difficult situation together, the people around you experience something: relief, safety, continuity, and they respond to you through the lens of that relief. The praise is sincere. The recognition is not manufactured. People around you feel better because of what you are doing, and they communicate this. Something in that communication answers a question you may not have consciously asked: whether your presence and competence matter. For a period, the role and genuine affirmation arrive together, and they begin to be experienced as the same thing. Necessity adds its own layer. When others cannot or do not assume the function, and the consequences of the function not being performed are visible, the role becomes morally weighted. Continuing to perform it is not simply practical. It feels right. It feels like the expression of something important about who you are and what you are willing to do for the people who matter to you. The role gathers meaning during this period. It is not just a function. It is evidence of something that feels fundamental about your character. The period of acute need eventually changes, or should. The illness stabilizes or ends. The business survives the difficult quarter. The family situation moves into a more ordinary configuration. What does not automatically change is the role. Because the role has, by this point, accumulated identity weight, moral weight, and relational weight simultaneously, and there is no natural mechanism that dissolves it when the original necessity diminishes. The urgency that justified the initial installation fades, but the installation itself remains. This persistence deserves acknowledgement rather than criticism. The role served a genuine purpose. The person who held it during the crisis carried something real, and often sustained real cost in doing so. The question that the Rolekeeper's index poses at this point is not whether the role was wrong. It was not. The question is whether the role remains accurately matched to the present situation, or whether it has continued past the expiration of the conditions that made it necessary, and begun editing reality in the process. There is a distinction between a role that remains responsive to current circumstances and one that has calcified into a permanent identity structure, regardless of whether the conditions still justify it. A plate of brass hammered onto a surface during an emergency may protect what lies beneath during that emergency. But when the emergency ends, the plate may simply cover what was there before, not protecting it but obscuring it. Once a role has been performed consistently, the people around you stop asking whether you will perform it. They incorporate it into their own planning. This is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary efficiency of social systems. When someone in a household reliably manages the finances, the other members of the household develop other competencies and allow the financial function to remain assigned. When someone in a professional team reliably coordinates complex situations, the team's structure distributes other responsibilities while keeping the coordinating role stable. The system becomes organized around the role's presence, and this organization is neither malicious nor unreasonable. It is how groups function efficiently. The result is that over time, alternatives to the role fail to develop. Nobody else learns the financial management because there is no apparent need. Nobody else assumes the coordinating function because it is already covered. The role's occupant becomes, in a structural sense, irreplaceable, not because no other person could ever learn the function, but because the system has organized itself around not needing to find out. This creates a genuine form of dependency that deserves to be named accurately. It is real, it has practical weight, and it cannot be dissolved by a simple decision to change behavior. When you imagine revising the role, you are not only imagining a change in your own behavior, you are imagining a change in the behavior of everyone organized around your role's consistency. Partners, children, colleagues, institutions, family systems, all of them have built their own patterns around your predictability. A change in your role is a change in their situation. Some of that change will be disruptive. Some of the disruption will be temporary, as alternatives develop and the system adapts. But dismissing the reality of that disruption would be as inaccurate as overstating it. The question the Rolekeeper's Index does not ask is whether the people around you are taking advantage of you. Many are not. Unconscious benefit is not the same as deliberate exploitation. A child who has always had a particular parent handle a particular domain of family life is not manipulating anyone. A colleague who has organized their workflow around your competence is not scheming. They have simply learned the system as it is, and the system as it is includes you in a specific position. Their learning is a consequence of the role's installation, not a cause of it. What this means practically is that role revision cannot be approached as a personal interior act that leaves the surrounding system unchanged. The role is embedded in a relational structure, and changes to the role require attention to that structure. This is a source of genuine complexity that the Rolekeeper's Index takes seriously. Responsible redesign is not the same as sudden departure. It involves communication, transition, and an honest accounting of what will need to change and for whom. The following chapters examine each major role family in turn, not to condemn the people who inhabit them, but to document precisely what evidence each role characteristically excludes, and what it costs to leave that evidence permanently unread. Chapter 3. The Provider. The provider role carries a particular kind of evidence filter because its defining currency is security, and security is a value that genuinely matters to the people depending on it. This makes the filter unusually difficult to question without appearing irresponsible. A provider who admits fatigue risks being heard as threatening withdrawal. A provider who admits career misalignment risks being heard as placing personal preference above family stability. A provider who admits fear risks being heard as calling the security itself into question. Each honest observation carries an unwanted secondary interpretation, and the secondary interpretation tends to arrive first. The evidence most consistently hidden inside the provider role belongs to three related categories: exhaustion that does not resolve with normal rest, significant career misalignment that has persisted over years rather than months, and private financial fear that the provider manages alone without sharing the actual figures or the actual weight. Exhaustion is renamed dedication. Misalignment is renamed the cost of responsibility. Private fear is renamed protection, the narrative being that the provider carries the worry so that others do not have to. These renamings are not false, but they are incomplete. And the incomplete version becomes the only version admitted into evidence. The moral weight assigned to the provider role does this work efficiently. When financial support is understood as the primary expression of love, commitment, or parental adequacy, then any private experience that conflicts with wanting to provide becomes morally suspect. A late career professional who has been the household's primary earner for 20 years and privately feels no connection to the work anymore is not experiencing a simple preference. They are experiencing a collision between genuine lived reality and a role that has become so morally freighted that the lived reality cannot be voiced without feeling like a betrayal. So it is not voiced, it is managed. Consider a person in their mid-50s who spent the prior 3 decades building a career in a field they entered for practical rather than passionate reasons. The career produced stability, education, security, opportunities, These outcomes are real and significant, but the career also produced a cumulative record of small disengagements, of going through forms that once required genuine engagement, of arriving at professional milestones and feeling, privately, briefly, before the feeling is put away, a particular kind of hollowness. That record exists. It is evidence. The provider role does not destroy it. It files it under not relevant to current decisions. What matters here is the distinction between a present duty and a permanent identity. Providing financially for people who legitimately depend on that provision is a present duty that may carry significant moral weight. But the permanence of that duty, whether it extends for the rest of a working life without review, without renegotiation, without honest accounting, is not something the duty itself establishes. That permanence is what the role establishes, and the role's authority to make that determination should be examined rather than simply accepted. The people who benefit from the provision and who may depend on it in ways that are entirely real are part of the picture, not the whole picture. Their needs exist, so does the evidence the provider has been filing away. Both deserve to be present in the same record. Financial security is a legitimate value, and the obligations it generates are not imaginary. A provider who supports dependent children, an aging parent, a partner whose own options are limited by health or circumstance, or a business whose collapse would harm others, is carrying obligations that have genuine moral weight. The Rolekeeper's Index does not dispute this. The obligations are real. What requires examination is what happens when security becomes not only a value but an argument, one that has learned to expand beyond the evidence available to support it. The security argument in its expanded form treats any financial uncertainty as a catastrophe and any consideration of change as a threat to everything that has been built. What would actually be threatened, and to what degree and over what time frame, and with what alternatives available? These questions do not receive careful examination because the security frame has already reached its conclusion before the evidence is gathered. Uncertainty is not assessed. It is felt as loss. This is not irrational. Financial stress is real, and the stakes of financial decisions for families and institutions are real. But when uncertainty is automatically treated as catastrophe, the provider loses the ability to distinguish between risks that are manageable with planning and changes that would genuinely cause harm. Gathering actual financial facts is the corrective action here, not as an exercise in optimism, but as a restoration of the evidence that the role has been treating as too dangerous to hold clearly. What are the real obligations? Over what period? With what flexibility in timing or structure? What transition scenarios actually exist, as opposed to the abrupt binary the security frame presents? Everything continues exactly as it is, or everything collapses. The gap between the role's catastrophic forecast and the actual evidential record is often significant, and it can only be measured by examining the facts rather than accepting the role's emotional summary of them. Qualified financial counsel belongs in this process where it is accessible. Not to validate a particular decision, but to provide an external accounting of actual conditions that is not filtered through the role's self-protective narrative. A person who has been carrying the security function alone, without sharing the real figures with a partner or trusted advisor, has been both bearing a weight and losing the benefit of external perspective. Both of those patterns can be revised without abandoning the responsibility. The distinction the provider needs to be able to draw is the one between transition planning and fantasy departure. The role fears that any examination of change is really a failure of commitment dressed in practical language. This fear is understandable. It is also, in most cases, not accurate. Responsible transition planning, examining what would need to change for whom over what period, with what preparation, is not abandonment. It is the opposite of abandonment. It is the careful treatment of real obligations by someone who takes them seriously enough to examine them honestly. The security argument that forecloses this examination is not protecting anyone. It is protecting the role's current configuration at the cost of accurate perception. Chapter 4. The Caregiver. The caregiver role generates its own specific evidence filter, and that filter operates through a moral logic that is unusually difficult to question. Care is understood as a good, and the emotions that conflict with caring, resentment, grief, fatigue, desire for another kind of life, are understood as disqualifications. A caregiver who admits resentment risks being heard as someone who resents the person being cared for. A caregiver who admits grief risks being heard as expressing a wish that the situation did not exist. A caregiver who admits a desire for a different kind of daily life risks being heard as wanting to leave the person who depends on them. These interpretations are not inevitable, but the caregiving role's moral framework makes them feel like the most immediate reading of any private admission. What this produces over time is a systematic gap between the caregiver's actual emotional record and the emotional record that feels permissible to acknowledge. Resentment accumulates without language. Grief arrives and is filed before it can be fully experienced. The desire for a different pace, a different set of daily activities, a different horizon, goes unnamed because the role treats desire as a luxury that caregiving has suspended. This is not a judgment about the quality of love or the sincerity of commitment. Genuine love and genuine resentment can coexist in the same person about the same situation. The caregiving role's moral architecture often refuses this coexistence, and the refusal costs the caregiver access to their own experience. The critical distinction is between an emotion and an action. Admitting resentment privately is not the same as withdrawing care. Naming grief to a trusted person is not a failure of service. Acknowledging a desire for different circumstances is not a decision to create them regardless of consequences. These are observations. They belong to the caregiver, and the person being cared for is not automatically harmed by the caregiver having access to their own inner record. In most cases, the caregiver who has processed their experience honestly is better able to sustain quality care than the one who has filed it all under inadmissible. The needs that never entered the record, for rest, for social contact, for projects that belong entirely to the caregiver, for medical attention deferred because the dependent's needs were always more pressing. These are also evidence. Their absence from the caregiver's acknowledged reality does not mean they have disappeared. It means they are accumulating in a different account, generating cost without generating response. The safety and well-being of the person being cared for is not improved by the caregiver becoming invisible to themselves. It depends, in real practical terms, on the caregiver's capacity being maintained, which requires honest attention to the caregiver's own condition. The daily structure of intensive caregiving is so completely organized around another person's needs that the caregiver's own rhythms, preferences, and self-descriptions can become, over time, entirely derivative. The morning schedule exists because of the dependent's medication, appointment, or routine. The evening schedule exists because of the dependent's meal, comfort, or supervision requirement. Social life contracts around what is feasible given the dependent's care schedule. Career possibilities are evaluated through the lens of availability rather than interest or trajectory. This is not an exaggeration of what intensive caregiving requires. It is an accurate description of what it actually produces in many adult lives. What gradually disappears in this structure is the caregiver's own self-description as a primary identity. The role becomes so comprehensive that asking, "Who are you?" apart from this care, produces either a long pause or a list of former identities that feel disconnected from the present. A person who was, before the caregiving period, someone who painted, led a team, traveled with friends, pursued a particular kind of intellectual work, or sustained a social life that belonged to them. That person has not gone anywhere, but the role has covered the description so thoroughly that the continuity between the previous self and the present one is difficult to locate. Guilt arrives consistently when care shifts even slightly. When a respite period is arranged, when a professional service takes over a function the caregiver has been performing personally, when the caregiver spends an afternoon in an activity entirely their own, the role interprets this relief as a form of negligence. The guilt is not proportionate to any actual harm done. It is proportionate to the degree to which the caregiver's identity has become coextensive with the caring function. When the function pauses, the identity feels suspended. Duty and total availability are not the same thing. Genuine duty to a person who depends on care does not require the caregiver to extinguish their own identity, deny their own experience, or carry the entire function alone without relief. These are not expressions of superior commitment. They are the structural outcome of a role that has expanded beyond what any single person can sustain indefinitely without cost. Shared care, respite support, and explicit limits on what a single caregiver can reasonably provide are not failures of caregiving. They are its preconditions over a long arc. Where shared care or professional support is genuinely inaccessible, that constraint deserves to be named accurately, as a constraint on a real situation, not as evidence that the caregiver's experience of that constraint is inadmissible. The caregiver's exhaustion and grief are not character flaws. They are the natural consequence of carrying a significant weight, and naming them does not threaten the care itself. It creates the conditions in which the care can continue without requiring the caregiver's entire self as the price of entry. Chapter 5. The Expert. The expert role is built on demonstrated mastery, and mastery carries its own form of social obligation. People defer to the expert not only because of competence, but because of the security that competence provides to those around it. When a leader, a senior professional, or a recognized authority on a given subject admits uncertainty, the admission travels through a system that has been organized around the assumption that the uncertainty does not exist. The people who depend on the expert's clarity, colleagues, students, clients, family members in a domain where the expert's knowledge is operational, experience expert uncertainty differently than the expert does. For the expert, it is information. For those around them, it may feel like structural instability. This creates a predictable and powerful incentive to keep questions private. The expert learns not through explicit instruction, but through accumulated social feedback, that uncertainty voiced is uncertainty registered, and that the registration carries consequences for how they are treated in the systems where their expertise is their primary credential. A physician who says, "I am not certain," is not being dishonest, but the system they operate in has historically been poorly equipped to hold that honesty alongside continued confidence in their judgment. A senior executive who names a gap in their own understanding is not being incompetent, but the organizational culture may treat the admission as a signal to recalibrate its assessment of their authority. What gets hidden, as a result, is the actual record of the expert's uncertainty. Questions that deserve examination go unasked in public settings because the role requires the appearance of resolution. Alternative perspectives that might be genuinely useful are discounted before they receive a full hearing, because engaging with them fully would require acknowledging that the expert's current position is not final. A person who has spent 25 years building expertise in a specific domain may have learned as a side effect of that investment that the role requires a particular posture, one that presents the completed edifice rather than the ongoing construction. The distinction between expertise and omniscience is not complicated in the abstract. Every expert knows intellectually that mastery is domain-specific, partial, and subject to revision. But the social architecture of the expert role does not always make that distinction operationally comfortable. When your professional identity, your team's confidence, your institution's public standing, and your own income are all partially organized around a portrait of assured competence, the gap between intellectual acknowledgement and lived practice becomes significant. The expert who has stopped asking questions in their own domain, not because the domain no longer has questions, but because the role has made asking feel costly, has begun using yesterday's evidence to navigate tomorrow's conditions. This is where expertise transitions from a live resource into a defended position. And defended positions, unlike genuine expertise, do not update when new information arrives. The expert's previously effective methods do not disappear when conditions change. They continue, often with increasing confidence, because the methods are associated with the outcomes that built the expert's reputation. A professional who achieved significant results using a particular approach carries that approach forward not merely out of habit, but out of justified confidence in its track record. The difficulty is that track records belong to the past, and conditions, technological, organizational, social, market, are not static. The method that produced results in one configuration may produce diminishing results in another, and the expert's role makes the diminishment harder to register accurately. When evidence arrives that the expert's approach is producing fewer results under current conditions, the evidence encounters a filtering system that has been assembled by success. The older method is not re-examined under current conditions, it is defended. Contradictory evidence is assigned to factors external to the method. The people involved were difficult, the timing was wrong, the supporting conditions were insufficient. This is not always an inaccurate assessment. Sometimes those factors are genuinely relevant. But when they are consistently invoked to protect a method from examination, they have become the role's rhetorical instrument rather than a genuine analysis of conditions. Technological or organizational transitions make this dynamic visible with particular clarity. A professional whose expertise was built in an era before a significant shift in tools, platforms, or organizational structure must navigate a genuine discontinuity. The expertise they built was real. The skills they developed were real. The question is whether those skills translate directly into the new configuration, or whether they require genuine updating, and whether the expert's role permits the honest examination of that question. Someone who was authoritative in a previous technological environment and now moves into a significantly changed one faces a specific choice: acknowledge the learning required, or maintain the role's authority by discounting the evidence of change. Genuine expertise is not threatened by acknowledging that conditions have shifted and that learning is required. Real mastery includes the meta-competency of recognizing when existing knowledge needs to be revised, supplemented, or in specific areas, replaced entirely. What is threatened by that acknowledgement is not the actual expertise. It is the role's self-portrait of complete, current, authoritative command of the domain. Those two things, actual expertise and the role's self-portrait, are not identical, and the gap between them should be examinable. Beginner behavior in an area of previous expertise is not humiliation, it is accurate calibration. The physician who says, in a new clinical context, "Help me understand how this is being handled here," is not losing their medical authority. They are using it intelligently. The executive who enters a transformed organizational landscape and asks the junior members of the team how things actually work is not diminishing their leadership. They are recovering the learning behavior that built their competence in the first place. The expert who cannot access beginner behavior in relevant domains has allowed the role to determine what counts as knowledge, and that determination is no longer serving them well. Chapter 6. The Peacekeeper. The peacekeeper carries a form of evidence filter that is particularly difficult to examine because it is organized around a genuine social value: reducing conflict, helping people understand one another, holding a group together during tension. These are not trivial contributions. They often require significant skill, patience, and attention. The peacekeeper learns these skills because the alternative, a system without them, produces outcomes that feel genuinely bad to witness. So the peacekeeper performs a function that the system needs, and performs it with real competence, and over time becomes identified with that function as completely as any other role family. What peacekeeping systematically hides is the peacekeeper's own perspective, the emotion they are not expressing, the preference they are not stating, the disagreement they are not voicing, the anger they reroute into mediation rather than allowing it to land where it belongs. These are not small omissions. Over months and years, a person who has learned to translate everyone in the room, whose primary function in a group is to understand, soften, bridge, and reassemble, has often stopped translating themselves. Their own position is the one that never gets the full treatment. It is the one that gets managed, qualified, held back, or expressed in a form so reduced that it no longer resembles the original thought. Mediation and self-erasure are not the same skill. A person who understands what it means to hold multiple perspectives and help others hear one another is not, by definition, a person who must hold none of their own. But the peacekeeper role frequently drifts into an operational identity, where personal perspective and group peace are experienced as incompatible. The role presents itself as a sacrifice of the first to preserve the second, and this sacrifice gradually becomes automatic. Family systems in which one person reliably absorbs tension are perhaps the clearest site for observing this pattern. Someone becomes the translator between a parent and a sibling, or between two partners in conflict, or between a household and an extended family whose expectations create ongoing friction. Each translation is an act of genuine skill. But the pattern teaches the group that this particular person's own position is the variable, not the fixed point, the element that adjusts so that everything else can remain stable. Workplace versions of this are equally common. The team member who prevents interpersonal escalation from becoming organizational crisis, and who, in doing so, consistently places their own response in the deferred pile. The hidden conflict in the peacekeeper's record is the gap between what they actually think and feel about a situation and what they have allowed into the conversation. The group believes it is operating with the peacekeeper's genuine participation. Often it is operating with a diplomatically managed version of that participation, while the actual record remains private and grows more dense. A particular kind of outcome develops when a peacekeeper has been absorbing decisions, accepting terms, and smoothing transitions over an extended period. The group begins to read their silence or their managed acquiescence as genuine agreement. Decisions get made based on the assumption that the peacekeeper is on board, because the peacekeeper has never clearly indicated otherwise. The group's consensus is partly an artifact. It is built on the peacekeeper's willingness to allow others' preferences to pass without the friction of a visible counterposition. But nobody in the group recognizes this because the friction's absence has always looked like consent. This is not the group's fault. They are reading the available signals. The available signals suggest agreement. The fact that those signals are managed rather than authentic is not visible from the outside, and the peacekeeper has taken significant care to ensure they are not visible. The result is a situation in which the group is operating on information it does not have, and the peacekeeper is accumulating a record of experiences, decisions lived, terms accepted, outcomes deferred to, that they did not choose in any meaningful sense. Resentment develops here with a particular character. It is not the resentment of a person who was overruled. It is the resentment of a person who was never actually in the room as themselves, even when they were physically present at every meeting, every conversation, every decision point. There is something disorienting about being resentful of outcomes you appear to accept, and that disorientation can delay recognition of what is actually happening. The role has been eating the very data it was supposed to be mediating. What the system is missing in practical terms is the peacekeeper's actual perspective, the disagreements that were managed away, the preferences that were never stated clearly, the boundaries that were never named because naming them would have generated the tension the role was designed to prevent. These are not minor informational gaps. A group that has organized itself around the false premise that one of its members is in full agreement with the general direction is making decisions on an incomplete record. That incompleteness eventually produces outcomes that do not serve the full group, because the full group was never actually present. Reintroducing disagreement proportionately is not a provocation. It is a restoration of accurate information to a system that has been operating without it. This does not require a sudden comprehensive disclosure or an emotional reckoning that destabilizes relationships. It can begin with small, clear statements of actual position in low-stakes contexts. The peacekeeper learning to voice a preference, then a concern, then an actual disagreement in settings where the stakes are manageable, where safety is a genuine consideration, where expressing disagreement carries real social or personal risk. That calculation deserves careful attention, and the decision about when and how to reintroduce honest positioning belongs to the person, not to the role. Chapter 7. The Strong One. Strength, as a social role, creates a specific kind of invisible ceiling. The strong one is the person others turn to when they themselves cannot hold something, when the news is too heavy, the situation too complicated, the fear too immediate. The strong one holds it. This is a genuine service. It provides other people with a resource they need in difficult moments. and the person who provides it often does so with real skill and real generosity. But the ceiling operates like this. The stronger the role's reputation, the less permission the person inside it receives, from others and from themselves, to need anything in return. Fear belongs to the strong one. Grief belongs to them. Confusion about what to do next, uncertainty about whether they are making the right decisions, physical exhaustion from carrying things that cannot be put down, all of this exists in the strong one's private record. What it does not have in most cases is a legitimate exit from private status. The strong one's role-appropriate response to fear is steadiness. To grief is composure. To exhaustion is continued functioning. These responses serve the people depending on the strong one's stability in the immediate term. They do not serve the strong one's accumulating interior record. The role's editing mechanism here operates through the expectations of others, which become internalized. People around the strong one have learned not to ask certain questions because the role's consistent response has trained them not to expect certain answers. When someone who has always projected solidity is asked how they are doing, the question is often asked with a slightly different weight than it carries for others, with an assumption built into it that the answer will be a variation of managing. The strong one has learned to deliver that variation convincingly, and has often delivered it so many times that the variation feels more natural than the honest answer would. The family crisis context makes this particularly visible. When a parent is ill, or a marriage is under serious strain, or a financial situation requires urgent management, someone becomes the organizational center. The person who calls the relevant parties, coordinates the response, carries the information, and holds the emotional temperature of the group. This is the strong one. They perform this function while also experiencing the same fear and grief as everyone else in the system. But the role requires that their experience remains secondary to the function, and so it is often processed later, privately, or not at all. The cost is real and accumulating. Containment and invisibility are not the same capability. A person who has developed genuine emotional strength, the capacity to hold difficult feelings without being operationally disabled by them, has a genuine resource. That resource is different from a situation in which feelings are suppressed rather than held, hidden rather than processed, denied rather than endured. The first is strength. The second is the role-performing strength while the person inside it accumulates evidence that has nowhere to go. A specific structural consequence follows from the strong one's consistent projection of self-sufficiency. The social support system that would normally develop around a person never fully assembles. Other people offer help where help is visibly needed. They check in with people who appear to be struggling. They make themselves available to people who have demonstrated the capacity to receive. The strong one's role communicates, consistently and over a long period, that help is not needed here, and the social environment responds accordingly by directing its support toward people who appear to need it. What this means in practice is that the strong one reaches a moment of genuine need and discovers that the infrastructure for receiving help is underdeveloped. The relationships that might provide support have been shaped by a long history in which support moved in one direction. The people closest to the strong one are accustomed to delivering their own difficulties and receiving steadiness in return. They have not developed the habits, the questions, the offers, the attentiveness that would allow them to recognize and respond to the strong one's need. Because those habits require practice, the relationship has not provided. When a strong one eventually becomes visibly unable to continue through illness, breakdown, departure, or some other form of visible failure, the people around them are often genuinely surprised. The surprise is evidence of how effective the role's concealment has been. It is also, for the strong one, a painful demonstration of the gap between how they have been seen and what has actually been accumulating. The anger that sometimes follows is real and understandable, but part of its source is the role's own participation in maintaining the concealment that produced the surprise. Graduated disclosure is the practical path forward, not a sudden reversal of the role's entire presentation, but the introduction in manageable amounts of accurate information about actual conditions. The strong one who says, in a context that allows for it, "This has been harder than I've let on," is not collapsing. They are beginning to populate the support system with accurate data. Over time, this changes the relational architecture in ways that benefit everyone involved, because relationships that hold an honest portrait of both participants are more stable and more sustaining than those built on a carefully maintained performance of invulnerability. Chapter 8. The Reliable One. The Reliable One's evidence filter operates through the categories of consistency and expectation. Reliability is a social and relational good. When people know that a commitment will be kept, they can build plans on that knowledge, and those plans may have significant stakes attached to them. The Reliable One's consistency is not merely a convenience. It provides structural support to systems that genuinely need it. This is what makes the role so durable, and what makes the editing it perform so difficult to interrupt, because any interruption carries the weight of potentially disrupting something real. What reliability characteristically hides is the fact of changed capacity. A person who made a commitment under conditions that existed 5 years ago may be operating in conditions that differ significantly from those original circumstances. Their health may have changed. Their other obligations may have expanded. Their own priorities may have shifted in ways that represent genuine maturation rather than irresponsibility. The capacity that made the original commitment reasonable may no longer be fully present, or present only at a cost that was not visible when the commitment was made. Maintaining a promise after the capacity to keep it has diminished produces a specific kind of performance, the visible output of reliability over a growing internal deficit. The Reliable One continues to appear at the expected hour, deliver the expected product, perform the expected service, but does so with increasing friction, decreasing quality or private cost that others cannot see because the external presentation has been preserved. Fear of disappointing others keeps the internal record from becoming visible. The word disappointing deserves attention here. Reliability has accumulated enough social weight in this role that failing to keep a specific commitment can feel equivalent to failing as a person. The schedule commitment and the identity have merged in the same way they merge in other role families. When the commitment slips, or when the Reliable One imagines it slipping, the feeling is not proportionate to the specific situation. It is proportionate to the entire identity structure that the reliability represents. A single adjustment to a single commitment feels globally threatening because the commitment is not, at the identity level, experienced as singular. It is experienced as the expression of who this person fundamentally is. Over time, the Reliable One's reputation becomes a kind of unwritten contract. Others plan around the predictability, and the Reliable One treats the plan as an obligation to be honored regardless of changed conditions. This is not an unreasonable extension of the role's original promise. Predictability is genuinely valuable, and the people organizing around it are not creating an unreasonable expectation. They are responding to a pattern the Reliable One established. The difficulty is when the pattern is experienced as immutable rather than as something that was chosen, and that can, with appropriate notice and care, be revised. What the Reliable One has often not fully examined is the distinction between their reputation and the specific commitments that reputation was built on. Reputation is a summary of past behavior. It is a portrait, not a contract. Past behavior does not in itself obligate future behavior independent of the current capacity to provide it. This is not a license for casual renegotiation or sudden disappearance from commitments others depend on. It is a recognition that reputation is not the same as an irrevocable agreement, and that adult relationships include the possibility of changing terms when conditions genuinely change. Changing one commitment can feel, from inside the role, as though it threatens all commitments simultaneously, as though conceding that one promise could not be kept at the same standard admits that the reliability itself was an illusion. This is the role making a categorical argument where a specific, practical one belongs. A single revised commitment, handled with genuine notice and honest explanation, does not undermine the entire structure of trustworthiness. It demonstrates that trustworthiness is being exercised thoughtfully rather than automatically, which is actually a more sophisticated and sustainable form of reliability than the version that cannot acknowledge changed conditions. Legitimate notice and thoughtful transition are the tools that distinguish responsible role revision from abandonment. A person who says, "I can no longer provide this at this volume beginning 3 months from now, and here is what I can offer as an alternative," is not breaking a contract. They are honoring the relationship that the contract served by treating the other party as capable of handling accurate information and adapting to it. Sudden disappearance and silent withdrawal, by contrast, are genuine disruptions, not because they revise the role, but because they leave others without the information they need to respond. The distinction is significant, and the reliable one's role tends to collapse it, treating revision as equivalent to disappearance in order to prevent any movement at all. Chapter 9. Who needs the role to remain? Several categories of people and systems benefit from the continuation of any established social role and examining them clearly, without transforming the examination into an accusation, is part of what the Rolekeeper's Index is designed to support. The benefit is real. The people and systems receiving it are not generally aware that they are receiving it, in the way that a person receiving warmth from a fire is not generally analyzing the fuel. They have organized their lives around the presence of the role's function, and they experience the role's continuation as simply the continuation of ordinary conditions. Who receives stability? The dependent child who counts on the provider's income, the family member who relies on the caregiver's daily presence, the team that navigates complexity through the expert's judgment, the household that depends on the peacekeeper's management of relational friction. All of these people experience material benefit from the role's continuation. Their lives are structured around its presence. This is not a fabricated dependency or an artificial need. It is the real outcome of a real role being performed over time. Who avoids learning because the role is available? The professional colleague who defers to the expert and therefore never develops independent judgment in that domain. The family member who defers to the provider and has not built their own financial literacy. The organizational member who routes difficult conversations through the peacekeeper and has not developed the capacity for direct communication. These are not people who are consciously avoiding growth. They are people who are responding rationally to a situation in which the role makes their avoidance of learning a viable option. The role's presence creates the conditions for the dependency, without anyone intending that outcome. Who gains emotional relief from the role's consistent performance? The people who do not have to hold the fear because the strong one holds it. The people who do not have to face difficult decisions because the peacekeeper smooths them. The people who do not have to manage transitions because the reliable one ensures that everything proceeds as expected. This relief is genuine. It produces real reduction in anxiety and real practical benefit, and it is in most cases entirely unconscious. The people experiencing it have not calculated the benefit and then conspired to preserve its source. They have simply adapted to a comfortable arrangement. The social system's resistance to change is not a conspiracy. Systems resist the revision of functional elements because revision creates temporary disorganization, uncertainty, and the need for redistribution of function. These are genuine costs in the short term, even when the revision is net beneficial in the longer term. Understanding this does not eliminate the friction of role revision. It does make the friction interpretable as a predictable feature of systemic change, rather than as evidence that the revision is wrong. When a role begins to change, its functions do not simply disappear. They either find a new occupant, develop across multiple people, get contracted out to an external resource, go partially unfulfilled for a period, or get reorganized in some combination of these ways. None of these outcomes is instantaneous. Each involves a period of adjustment, and the adjustment period carries real costs: discomfort, reduced efficiency, the need for learning, the friction of renegotiated expectations. These costs are often invoked by the role holder themselves as reasons not to initiate any change, and by the system's other members as evidence that the change is unwelcome. The discomfort and temporary inefficiency that follow role redistribution are evidence of transition, not evidence of error. A household that has depended entirely on one person for a particular function, financial management, logistical coordination, emotional regulation, will experience that function's redistribution as disorganized and harder than the previous arrangement. This is accurate. Redistribution is harder than continuation in the immediate term. It requires effort that continuation does not require, because continuation operates on established patterns, while redistribution must build new ones. Training and transition deserve explicit acknowledgement here because they are often treated as obstacles rather than as the actual content of redistribution. For the family member who has not developed financial literacy to begin developing it, time and guidance are required. For the team to develop collective competence in a domain previously held by a single expert, deliberate practice is required. This investment is real, and naming it accurately as a real temporary cost rather than a permanent burden is part of what allows redistribution to be approached as a responsible option rather than an impossible one. Legitimate resistance from those affected by redistribution deserves the same honest treatment. Some resistance comes from genuine dependency that requires careful management of transition timelines. A child who depends on caregiving cannot be assigned responsibility for their own care before they are developmentally capable of it. A business that is in a vulnerable period may not be the right context for the simultaneous revision of multiple organizational roles. These constraints are real, and they affect the timing and pace of responsible redesign rather than the possibility of it. The question is not whether constraints exist, but whether they determine the ceiling or only the timeline. Fair distribution of responsibility is not a state that can be defined once and held permanently. It is a condition that requires ongoing assessment as people's capacities and circumstances change, and as the systems they inhabit evolve. The Rolekeeper's Index does not produce a definitive redistribution plan. It produces the perceptual clearing that makes honest planning possible by restoring the evidence that the role has been preventing from entering the record. Chapter 10. What the role costs you to see. The evidence that a role systematically excludes does not disappear because it has been excluded. It continues to accumulate. It continues to arrive in the form of physical fatigue that persists past rest, in the recurring thought that is managed away before it can complete itself, in the small private calculation that gets performed and then filed, in the moment of watching someone else make a choice that you have not allowed yourself to make and feeling something you cannot quite name. The evidence is there. The role has not destroyed it. The role has placed it in a register that does not connect to decisions. Fatigue, change desire, and failing systems are three categories of evidence that the role consistently routes away from operational awareness. Fatigue that presents as a message rather than a problem, as evidence that something in the current configuration requires change rather than as a deficiency to overcome, cannot enter the record while the role is in charge of what counts as relevant. Change desire, the genuine internal shift in what matters, what is valued, what feels worth doing, does not enter the record while the role defines desire as something that belongs to people who do not yet have responsibilities. Failing systems, relationships that are not working, professional arrangements that are producing diminishing returns, financial structures that require examination, do not enter the record while the role interprets examination as destabilization. Each of these categories of evidence appears repeatedly over time. This is the feature of excluded evidence that is most worth observing. It returns. The same fatigue presents again in 6 months. The same private calculation arrives again in a year. The same observation about a failing system appears again after the previous crisis passed. The recurrence is not pathology. It is the evidence's attempt to become admissible, the signal's attempt to reach the decision-making level. The role intercepts it at the same point each time, using the same reinterpretation, but the signal continues to be generated. The vocabulary of the interception is worth examining specifically. Common role-generated dismissals include, "This is just a difficult period." Everyone feels this way sometimes. Once this particular situation resolves, I'll have more space to think about it. I knew this would be hard, and hard is not the same as wrong. I can't afford to think about this right now. Each of these statements may sometimes be accurate. What makes them role-generated rather than genuine assessments is that they are applied reflexively, at the same evidential threshold, each time a particular category of observation arrives, without examining whether the current instance actually meets the standard they invoke. The delay in responding to excluded evidence carries an accumulating cost that is often invisible during the accumulation period. Because no single delayed response constitutes an obvious error, the pattern of delay can continue for years without producing a moment of visible consequence. The cost is distributed across many small decisions, many small deferrals, many small reinterpretations. It shows up eventually in the distance between who the person is and who they could have been with access to their full evidential record. That distance is harder to measure than a single costly decision, but it is not less real. Decisions made on an incomplete evidential record produce outcomes that are organized around the role's portrait rather than the full human reality. Career paths are pursued longer than the evidence of sustained engagement would support because the provider role requires visible trajectory. Family arrangements are sustained in forms that increasingly misrepresent the actual relational situation because the peacekeeper role requires apparent harmony. Professional relationships are maintained past the point of mutual benefit because the reliable one's role requires continuity of commitment. These decisions are not arbitrary. They are the logical outcomes of perception filtered by role. The alternatives that get excluded are often not dramatic or reckless. They are the ordinary range of human choices that simply do not fit within the role's permitted vocabulary. The late career professional who might have restructured their work to create more room for the things that actually matter to them, that alternative was excluded not because it was impractical, but because the provider's self-portrait did not include it as a possibility. The caregiver who might have developed structures that distributed responsibility more equitably, that alternative was excluded because the caregiving role's moral framework treated it as abandonment before it was ever examined on its merits. Identity narrows over time when a single role is allowed to function as its primary container. The person who was before the role's full installation, someone with a range of self-descriptions, a curiosity, a relationship, an aesthetic, a set of commitments that existed independently of usefulness to others, becomes someone whose self-description has contracted to the role's vocabulary. The contraction is gradual and therefore difficult to perceive from inside. It becomes visible largely in contrast to a specific kind of encounter, meeting someone from a previous period of life, or returning to an activity that predates the role, or finding oneself momentarily in a context where the role is irrelevant. In those moments, something registers as having been lost, not dramatically but precisely. As the role becomes the primary identity structure, others become increasingly calibrated to it, which makes revision increasingly costly. The dependent whose life is organized around the provider's continued provision genuinely cannot adapt overnight. The family system, whose relational equilibrium is maintained by the peacekeeper, genuinely will experience disruption when the peacekeeper begins to voice their actual position. These costs are real, but their reality has a direction. The longer role revision is delayed, the greater the systemic dependence becomes, and the more costly revision appears from inside the role. The role uses its own installed depth as an argument against revision. This is perhaps its most powerful editing move, turning the consequence of delay into evidence that change is impossible. Long-term self-alienation is the cumulative outcome. Not a dramatic rupture, but a slow drift from one's own account. The person who arrives at a specific age or life stage and discovers that they do not know what they actually want, not because the question is philosophically difficult, but because the role has managed their desires so effectively for so long that the genuine version is no longer easily accessible, is experiencing the cost of sustained evidence exclusion. The Rolekeeper's Index is not designed to reverse this cost through a single insight. It is designed to restore access to the excluded record, one category of evidence at a time. Chapter 11. When the role is still right. Not every role that carries significant burden is a role that has outgrown its justification. There is a form of service that is chosen with genuine awareness of its costs, sustained with genuine consent, and reviewed with genuine honesty. And this form deserves to be named clearly and protected from the analysis that applies to roles that have been installed without examination. A role can be both demanding, and right. These are not mutually exclusive conditions. The distinguishing feature of chosen service is alignment between the present values of the person performing it and the nature of the service being performed. Not alignment that was established at the outset and has not been questioned since, but alignment that is periodically examined and found to remain genuine. A person who provides financially for a household because they have reviewed the arrangement and find that it reflects what they actually care about, the security of specific people they love, the expression of a commitment they have chosen, is in a different situation from someone performing the same function while carrying an unexamined record of misalignment. The external behavior may look identical. The internal situation is not. Awareness of cost is another marker. A person in a genuinely chosen role has allowed the costs of that role into their evidential record without minimizing them. They know what they are spending. They have made an informed decision that the spending is worth it relative to what the role makes possible. This is different from a person who has been managing away the evidence of cost in order to prevent questioning the role's continuation. Awareness of cost does not require constant articulation of grievance. It requires that the cost is held as real information rather than as inadmissible evidence. Genuine consent includes the capacity to review. A person who could revise a role but chooses not to is in a different position from a person who cannot imagine revision as a real option. If the role's continuation is genuinely chosen, the possibility of not continuing it should be a thinkable thought. Not an attractive one necessarily, but a real one. When revision cannot even be considered without triggering a collapse of the entire identity structure, the role is no longer serving as an expression of choice. It has become a necessity, and necessities do not constitute consent. Boundaries and support are also markers of a role that remains appropriately inhabited. A chosen caregiver who has developed limits around what they can provide alone, who has built shared structures where possible, and who maintains access to their own experience and self-description, is inhabiting their role differently from a caregiver who has allowed the role to consume the full person. The boundary is not a failure of commitment. It is what makes sustained high-quality commitment possible over a long arc, rather than a period of total dedication followed by collapse. There is also a legitimate category of temporary intensification. Life contains periods where circumstances produce demands that significantly exceed ordinary levels. Periods of crisis, transition, loss, emergency, or exceptional opportunity that require someone to carry more than their sustainable long-term load for a defined time. The Rolekeeper's Index recognizes this category explicitly because the framework developed here can otherwise be misapplied to situations where the evidence of burden is real, but the appropriate response is not role revision, but endurance through a genuinely bounded period. The key features of a difficult season, as opposed to a role that has permanently exceeded its appropriate scope, are temporal definition and purposeful framing. A temporary intensification is one where the increased demand is connected to a specific, identifiable situation that has a foreseeable end. The parent managing a child's serious illness is carrying more than their ordinary load, and the situation has a trajectory: recovery, adaptation, resolution, even if that trajectory is uncertain. The professional navigating a company crisis is operating beyond their ordinary capacity, and the crisis has a horizon, even if its exact timing is not known. The increased load makes sense in relation to the specific situation. Increased responsibility during a difficult season does not require the suspension of all rest and assistance. Even within a period of genuine emergency, the person carrying the increased load has a legitimate claim to whatever support can be arranged, to whatever periods of rest the situation permits, and to the honest acknowledgement of what the period is costing. Framing a difficult season as a period of total self-sacrifice without any legitimate claim to support is not a more honorable approach. It is a path toward the kind of depletion that eventually impairs the very function the person is trying to sustain. Review points should be established explicitly during difficult seasons. A time or condition under which the situation will be reassessed, the crisis resolved or adapted to, the intensified responsibility distributed or released, the person's own needs returned to primary consideration. Without these review points, a difficult season can silently expand into a permanent arrangement, and its temporary character can be retrospectively reclassified as the original premise disappears from the record. The role is particularly efficient at this kind of reclassification because once the difficult season's conditions become ordinary, the evidence that they were ever temporary is difficult to retrieve. A difficult season is not a permanent identity. It is a period of legitimate extraordinary demand that can and should return to a more sustainable configuration when the specific conditions that justify it have changed. Holding this distinction clearly, while fully inhabiting the demands of the season, is not a form of insufficient commitment. It is the perceptual literacy that makes genuine commitment sustainable over the full scope of a life. Chapter 12. The Rolekeeper Audit. The Rolekeeper Audit begins not with a diagnosis of whether the role is appropriate, but with a clear description of what the role actually is. Before any assessment of its cost or legitimacy is possible, the role must be named, not as a job title or a relational category, but as the specific social function it performs and the self-portrait it generates. The naming is the first act of perceptual recovery. A role that has not been named cannot be examined. It simply operates. Begin with the role itself, stated plainly. Not, I am a father, or I am a manager. These are identities, not roles in the specific sense the Rolekeeper's index is tracking. The role in this sense is the function within the relational or institutional system, the one who solves financial problems, the one who prevents conflict, the one who knows what to do, the one who never needs help, the one who shows up regardless of conditions. State it in the third person initially, as if describing someone else, because this distance allows the description to be more precise than the first person tends to permit. Name who depends on the role's continuation. Be specific and honest about the dependents. Not everyone, which is an abstraction that protects the role from examination, but the actual people whose actual lives are organized around the role's consistent performance. The child who has not developed a particular competency because the role always supplied it. The partner whose planning assumes the role will continue. The team whose structure does not include a backup for the function the role provides. Specificity here is clarifying rather than indicting. The dependence may be entirely legitimate. It needs to be seen clearly. Name the role's original purpose. When was it installed? Under what conditions? What problem was it solving? What did it make possible for the people it served? This naming is important because it prevents the analysis from becoming a retroactive condemnation of a role that was, at its origin, a reasonable and even admirable response to genuine circumstances. The original purpose may still be operative, or it may have been superseded by changed conditions while the role remained in place. The audit cannot determine which is true until the original purpose is described accurately. Name the current duties the role generates. What does performing this role actually require day by day, week by week? What time does it consume? What decisions does it drive? What else does it prevent? Current duties may be larger or different from the original ones. Roles tend to accumulate function over time. Naming the current duties produces a description of the role's actual present scope, which may differ significantly from both its original scope and the implicit social agreement that installed it. Name the rewards that the role provides and the fears that its revision generates. Both are real and both belong in the audit. The rewards may include genuine satisfaction, social recognition, relational closeness, a sense of purpose, material security, or identity coherence, any combination of these. The fears may include loss of relevance, loss of relationship, loss of security, loss of the self-description the role provides, or fear of the specific consequences that would follow from the role's revision. Naming both without discarding either produces an honest accounting of why the role has continued and what it would cost to change. The sentence at the center of this audit is not complicated. It begins, "If I were not required to be the each deputy one, I could admit that." The blank holds the role's specific function as the role holder actually experiences it, not the polished version, not the version shared with others, but the one that requires honesty to state. The completion that follows is not a decision, a plan, or a commitment. It is an admission, a single fact, feeling, or desire that has been excluded from the role's permitted record. The completion may arrive as something ordinary, which does not make it less significant. I could admit that I am tired of this and have been for longer than I can remember. I could admit that I do not know what I want anymore. I could admit that I'm afraid this is all there is. I could admit that there is a different life I keep returning to in my own mind. I could admit that some of the people I'm holding this together for would survive its revision better than I am surviving the continuation. These are not dramatic revelations. They are the quiet sentences that the role has been stopping at the same point for months or years. Once the admission has been made privately, it becomes possible to separate what it actually contains: the factual component, the emotional component, and the desire component. These are not the same thing, and they do not each require the same response. A feeling of exhaustion is an observation about a current state. It is information about load and capacity, not a decision about continuation. A desire for a different kind of life is a genuine psychological fact about the person's orientation. It is not a plan, not a betrayal, and not a command to act immediately without accounting for consequences. Keeping these categories distinct prevents the admission from either being dismissed, it's just a feeling, or treated as more directive than it is. Testing an admission against real consequences is a separate step from making it. Once the hidden sentence has been completed, it becomes possible to ask, if this is true, what does it actually change? Some admissions, when examined clearly, reveal that the feared consequence of their truth is significantly smaller than the role's catastrophic framing suggested. Others reveal genuine complexity that requires careful, sustained attention. The admission itself does not determine which category it belongs to. Only honest examination of the evidence can do that. For this particular step, the reflection belongs to you privately. It is not a question designed for public sharing or for anyone else's response. If you are willing to complete the sentence, if I were not required to be the A Suyin one, I could admit that. Let the completion exist exactly as it arrives, without immediately editing it back into the role's vocabulary. Give it the status of evidence, even temporarily. That is the beginning of the recovery. The index is designed to support. Chapter 13. Restoring the hidden evidence. The most important structural fact about recovering hidden evidence is that admission and decision are not the same step. They are separated by a significant gap, and collapsing that gap is one of the primary mechanisms by which excluded evidence remains excluded. The role has learned to intercept threatening observations before they become admissions by suggesting that admission is equivalent to commitment, that if you fully allow a thought to be true, you're already committed to acting on it in the most disruptive form possible. This conflation is the role's most efficient deterrent. Beginning to restore excluded evidence means, first, stating the hidden fact privately without requiring it to immediately produce a life restructuring. I am not sure I want to continue in this career is a statement of a genuine experience. It is not a resignation letter. I am carrying more of this care than I can sustain at this level indefinitely is accurate information about capacity and load. It is not an announcement of abandonment. The private statement deserves to exist as a real thought, held without immediate instrumentalization, examined without the role's emergency framing, before it becomes the basis of any action. Gathering supporting evidence is the next movement. Once an admission has been made private and stable, it becomes possible to examine what else in the record supports or complicates it. The fatigue, how long has it been present? Under what conditions does it intensify? Under what conditions, if any, does it reduce? The misalignment, what specific features of the current situation produce it? What did the situation look like before the misalignment became persistent? The resentment, what precisely is it directed at? The function itself or the terms under which the function is being performed? Evidence gathering at this stage is not preparation for a confrontation. It is the restoration of accurate perception. Distinguishing emotion from command is a skill the role has actively prevented from developing in the domains it governs. Emotions about one situation carry genuine information about what is happening and about what matters. They do not by themselves constitute a directive. Sustained grief about a caregiving situation tells the caregiver something real and important about their experience. It does not by itself determine what the caregiver should do next. Sustained frustration about a professional trajectory tells the professional something real about their relationship to their work. It does not determine the timeline or form of any change. Holding the emotion as information while deferring the decision allows the information to be fully received before it is responded to. Recurrence is the most reliable indicator that an observation has moved past the category of a passing mood. An observation that returns consistently across different conditions, different periods, different contexts, that has appeared before a difficult week and after an easier one, that persists regardless of the immediate circumstances, is evidence that it belongs to the structural level of the person's situation rather than to its temporary surface. This is the observation that deserves most careful attention, and that the role most consistently routes toward deferral. Recurring evidence is the most important evidence. It should be treated as such. Trusted external perspective is part of the evidence restoration process, and it is often where the process becomes genuinely useful rather than remaining a private interior exercise. The role's editing mechanism is most powerful in the interior, where its vocabulary is installed, where its moral framework is most immediately operative, where its reinterpretations happen fastest. An external perspective that is genuinely trusted and genuinely neutral, neither aligned with the role's continuation nor invested in its revision, provides a reference point outside the role's interpretive framework. Genuinely trusted and genuinely neutral is a demanding standard. It excludes people who are themselves beneficiaries of the role's continuation, because their perspective will naturally be shaped by the situation the role sustains for them. It also excludes people whose relationship with the role holder is organized primarily around their own needs, rather than an accurate perception of the role holder's situation. What it includes is a person, a close friend from a previous period, a professional outside the immediate institutional context, a family member with no stake in the specific situation, who can hear the hidden admission without immediately framing it through the lens of their own interests. Financial or practical data belongs in the evidence restoration process wherever it is relevant. The provider who has been carrying a security argument that treats any uncertainty as catastrophic will often find, when actual financial data is gathered and examined carefully, that the range of feasible options is different from what the role's framing suggested. The caregiver who has been managing alone may find, when the practical resources available are genuinely surveyed, that alternatives exist that were not examined because the role's moral framework preempted the search. Practical data does not resolve every question, but it replaces the role's generalized catastrophic forecast with specific examinable information. Professional counsel, financial advisors, attorneys, therapists, physicians, organizational consultants belongs in this process wherever the stakes or complexity justify it, not to validate a particular choice, but to provide an assessment of actual conditions that is insulated from the role's narrative. The role's story about a situation is not always wrong. It is sometimes an accurate summary of genuine constraints, but it requires external verification to know which is the case. And that verification is precisely what the role tends to prevent by treating consultation as unnecessary, premature, or a sign of failure. Comparing the role's story about a situation with the actual evidential record often produces a specific and clarifying discovery. The story is not entirely wrong, but it is not entirely right either. Some of the constraints it identifies are real. Some of them are projections organized by the role's need to prevent examination. Some of what the role treats as permanent is actually contingent and could be renegotiated with appropriate notice. Some of what the role treats as impossible has simply never been seriously examined. The comparison does not produce a dramatic exposure of deception. It produces a more accurate map of an actual situation, one that includes real constraints and real possibilities in their actual proportions. Duties that are genuine deserve to be preserved. This is a non-negotiable commitment of the Rolekeeper's Index. Restoring excluded evidence is not a process designed to produce role abandonment. The evidence restoration process produces an accurate picture, one that includes what is genuinely owed, to whom, and under what terms. Within that picture, it becomes possible to identify what actually requires change, as opposed to what the role has bundled together with genuine obligation to make examination more difficult. The two categories can be separated, and separating them is what makes responsible redesign possible. Chapter 14. Redesigning the role. Role redesign is not a binary choice between complete continuation and complete withdrawal. It is a set of practical modifications to the scope, distribution, and terms of the role's performance. The modifications exist on a spectrum from minor to significant, and the appropriate modification in any specific situation depends on the actual evidence gathered during the previous phases, the real obligations, the real alternatives, the real capacity, and the real preferences of everyone involved. There is no universal prescription. There is a practical vocabulary for approaching the design. Reduction in scope means defining the role's function more precisely than it has been practiced, and withdrawing from the areas where the role has expanded beyond its original or legitimate boundaries. A provider who has been managing not only finances but every logistical decision in a household because those functions gradually accumulated around the financial role is not necessarily obligated to continue all of them. A caregiver who has been providing not only direct care but also the emotional management of the entire family system around the caregiving situation can legitimately examine which of those functions are actually theirs to carry. Reduction does not diminish the commitment to the core function. It releases the accretion that surrounded it without explicit agreement. Sharing responsibilities means identifying specific functions within the role's domain that could be performed by other people with appropriate investment of time and guidance. The expert who has been the sole resource for a particular kind of institutional knowledge can share that knowledge deliberately with intention to develop others' capacity in ways that do not diminish the value of the expertise, but do reduce the exclusive dependency that currently organizes around it. The caregiver who has been the sole provider of certain forms of daily support can identify family members, professional services, or community resources that could participate in providing those forms of support. Sharing requires the temporary investment of teaching and oversight, which is real effort, but it produces a fundamentally different distribution of load over time. Rotation of leadership or care creates a structural norm that a single person is not the permanent, exclusive occupant of a role, but rather the person currently in that position with the expectation of eventual transition. This kind of redesign requires explicit agreement and planning, and it works best when initiated before the role holder reaches a level of depletion that makes any form of proactive planning difficult. Emergency limits, explicit statements of what the role will and will not provide in crisis conditions, are a related tool. They establish in advance that the role has a boundary, which is information the system around the role needs to have and should not discover only when the limit is reached unplanned. Review points formalize the redesign process by establishing a future moment at which the current arrangement will be deliberately reassessed. This prevents a revised role from simply calcifying into a new permanent identity structure through the same mechanism that produced the first one. The review point does not promise a particular outcome. It may result in the confirmation that the current arrangement remains appropriate, or it may result in further modification. Its function is to preserve the capacity for honest assessment on an ongoing basis, rather than allowing the arrangement to achieve permanence by default. Redesigning the role privately, without communicating the change to the people who are organized around its previous configuration, does not produce role redesign. It produces a gap between the role as currently practiced and the role as it was expected to continue, and that gap, when others eventually encounter it, is experienced as a betrayal of the previous arrangement rather than as a responsible revision of it. Communication is not an optional step in role redesign. It is the step that makes redesign real rather than merely interior. Stating changed capacity means being direct about what has changed and how it affects the function the role was performing, not a comprehensive account of the psychological journey that led to the change. That level of disclosure is rarely necessary and often counterproductive. A clear, specific statement of what is different. I can no longer continue to handle this volume of responsibility without significant cost to my own situation. I will need to change the terms under which I provide this function. There are aspects of this arrangement that are not sustainable in their current form. These statements give the system the information it needs to begin adapting. Stating what remains is equally important and often overlooked in favor of the statement of what is changing. The people organized around the role need to know not only what is being revised but what is not. The provider who is examining career trajectory is not withdrawing financial support from dependent family members. The caregiver who is establishing limits on their availability is not ending care. The expert who is acknowledging uncertainty in a domain is not abandoning their institutional function. The distinction between what is changing and what continues is information that the system needs, and providing it clearly prevents the legitimate anxiety about genuine obligations from merging with the role's own catastrophic framing of all change as total departure. Stating what must move, which specific functions or responsibilities need to shift to other people or arrangements, is the most practically demanding part of the communication because it makes real requests of real people and may produce real resistance. Expecting that resistance to be comfortable is not realistic. Expecting it to be permanent is in most cases also not accurate. Systems adapt when they have both the information that adaptation is required and sufficient time to accomplish it. Adjustment time, a genuine transition period during which the redistribution is implemented rather than demanded immediately, is not a concession that weakens the redesign. It is what makes the redesign credible and sustainable. Refusing to treat role revision as an identity debate is the final communication skill this step requires. When the communication of changed terms is received as evidence that the role holder has become a different person, less committed, less reliable, less trustworthy, and when the conversation shifts toward evaluating who that person is rather than what the practical arrangement should look like going forward, the role holder needs to redirect. The question is not whether the redesign is evidence of changed character. The question is what the new arrangement will be, what it will provide, what timeline it will follow, and what support the transition requires. Keeping the conversation at that practical level is itself an act of care for the people the conversation involves. Final chapter: the person beneath the plate. Once the role begins to be examined separately from the identity it has been organizing, a specific kind of recovery becomes possible. The extraction of values that existed before the role's installation and that continue to exist within it, but that do not depend on the role's specific form for their expression. This is not the authentic self as a fixed inner treasure waiting to be uncovered. It is a more pragmatic and adult observation that the things you genuinely care about, the things that generate your deepest engagement and your clearest sense of purpose, are not coextensive with the specific relational and institutional function you have been performing. They have a wider range of expression than the role has permitted. The care that the caregiver has been expressing through the specific functions of direct personal care can exist in other forms. Care for people, for communities, for work, for ideas, without requiring the specific structure of the caregiving role. The values of attentiveness, commitment, and responsiveness that the caregiver genuinely holds are portable. They can be carried into forms of engagement that do not require the caregiver to absorb the function in its current totality. Separating the value from the specific role form that has expressed it does not diminish the value. It expands the available repertoire for living from it. The same separation applies to the expert's competence. The genuine intellectual rigor, curiosity, and depth of understanding that built the expertise are not identical to the expert's current institutional status or the specific authority structure that surrounds their role. These qualities, the actual cognitive and relational capacities, continue to exist independently of whether the role's specific configuration is maintained or revised. Separating expertise from expert status allows the genuine competence to travel forward, even as the institutional form of the role changes. Reliability, similarly, is separable from the specific form of endless availability that the reliable one's role has come to require. The capacity to keep commitments, to follow through on what matters, to be a person whose word has weight, these are portable values, expressions of character that do not require the specific contract of unlimited, unrevised, permanent consistency that the role has built around them. Reliability exercised within honest limits is not lesser reliability. It is reliability at a sustainable level, which is, over the long arc, more genuinely reliable than the version that produces eventual collapse. Carrying values into new forms requires some experimentation and some tolerance for the discomfort of being a beginner again. The caregiver who begins to express care through a community volunteer role, or a creative project, or a professional direction that was deferred, is not experienced in those forms the way they are experienced in caregiving. The expert who begins to engage their curiosity in a domain outside their established authority is not authoritative there, in the way they are in their primary field. The early stage of any new form is marked by incompetence and uncertainty, and the role's trained fear of incompetence makes this initial stage genuinely uncomfortable. It is the necessary entry point. There is a particular kind of context in which the role has no jurisdiction, the space where usefulness is not the criterion for belonging, an activity undertaken for its own sake, without any output that the role could claim as evidence of its continued performance. A relationship in which your presence is wanted without reference to what you can provide or manage. A context in which what you know is not the primary thing, where what you produce is not being evaluated, where your reliability is irrelevant because nothing is being coordinated. These are the contexts where the person beneath the plate becomes visible, because the plate's identifying inscription is not legible there. Beginner status in these contexts is not humiliating. It is, if anything, a form of relief, though a relief that often arrives disguised as discomfort. The person who has been the expert for 20 years and picks up an instrument they have never played, or learns a craft they have never tried, or enters a subject area they know nothing about, experiences something unfamiliar, the absence of the role's usual authority structure. There is no one deferring, no one asking for direction, no one organizing around their competence. This absence can feel destabilizing initially. It is also where a genuine encounter with curiosity, not professional curiosity directed toward mastery, but the simpler curiosity of someone who does not know something and finds that interesting, becomes possible again. Receiving care, as opposed to providing it, is perhaps the most difficult competency for the caregiving, providing or strong one role to develop. Receiving requires the acknowledgement that something is needed, an acknowledgement that these roles have spent considerable energy preventing. When someone offers help, and the help is genuinely needed, allowing it to be accepted without immediately converting it into an opportunity to demonstrate that it was not actually necessary, is a specific skill. It is also evidence-generating. Each experience of receiving, of being attended to, helped, included in someone else's care, is a data point that corrects the role's implicit claim that the only available position in a relationship is the functional one. Expressing preference in low-stakes contexts is a beginning, not the major preferences that the role has been suppressing for years. Those require more preparation than a simple low-stakes experiment provides, but the small, ordinary ones. What you want to eat, where you want to spend an afternoon, which direction the conversation goes, what kind of movie you choose. These are not trivial experiments. They are the restoration of the perceptual habit that the role has allowed to atrophy, the habit of registering one's own preferences as relevant information before automatically checking them against what the role requires. Practicing disagreement in safe settings is the corresponding skill. Choosing a context where the stakes are genuinely low, a discussion about something inconsequential with someone who is not dependent on your management of their emotional state, and voicing an actual position rather than the diplomatically managed version. The peacekeeper who says in a friendly conversation, "I actually see this differently," without immediately softening the disagreement into reconciliation, is practicing a capacity that the role has allowed to erode. The strong one who says, "I found that difficult," without adding a qualifier that cancels the admission, is practicing the same. Each of these experiments generates new evidence about who you are when the role is not the organizing principle. It may be evidence of a preference, a capacity, an orientation, or a form of engagement that the role has covered. It is evidence that belongs to the inscription beneath the plate. Over time, as these experiments accumulate, a self-description that is not organized primarily around usefulness begins to become available, not as a replacement for the genuine commitments you carry, but as an expansion of what you are permitted to be in the space that those commitments do not fully occupy. Somewhere in that expanding space, the sentence that opened this book is still waiting. Not the version that was interrupted, but the version that can be completed. The private admission that has been stopped at the same point, managed back into the role's vocabulary each time it has arrived. The sentence about exhaustion or uncertainty, or desire or grief, or the different life that keeps returning in your own imagination. It was never really about leaving the people who depend on you. It was always about whether what you know is allowed to be real. Epilogue. The index reveals the covered line. Return now to the private admission, not as a crisis, not as a declaration, but as a simple practice of accuracy. The sentence began at the opening of this book and was interrupted by the weight of what the role requires you to remain. It is still incomplete. Completing it, in whatever form it actually takes for the specific situation you are in, is not a collapse of the structure around you. It is an act of honest record-keeping applied to your own life. The completion is yours alone. It does not require an audience or a verdict. What it requires is that the role be removed from its position at the editor's desk long enough for the actual thought to land. I am more tired than I have admitted. I have not wanted this in longer than I have been willing to say. There is a part of what I am carrying that I did not consciously agree to and have never been able to renegotiate. Whatever the specific sentence is, ordinary or complicated, expected or surprising, it belongs to your evidential record. It has as much right to be there as every obligation and every commitment the role has kept in front of you. From that admitted fact, the next question is practical rather than philosophical. What does this evidence actually require? Not what the role fears it requires, not the total dissolution of every arrangement, but what specific, bounded, measured response this particular piece of evidence calls for. Some admissions will require a conversation, some will require a decision, some will require simply being held for a period, examined across time, allowed to exist until their full shape becomes clear. The fact determines the response. The role no longer gets to determine which facts are allowed to generate responses. A role, recovered from the position of permanent identity and returned to the position of chosen function, becomes something an adult can enter and exit with deliberate awareness. The provider who understands their role as a function, one they are currently performing, one they can continue, revise, or transition from with appropriate planning, is inhabiting a fundamentally different relationship to that function than the provider for whom the role has become the only available self-description. The function may look identical from the outside. The perceptual freedom inside it is entirely different. The role continues to carry real duties. Those duties are not dissolved by the realization that the role is a function rather than a fate. A parent who provides for children who genuinely depend on that provision continues to carry real obligations. A caregiver who supports someone who cannot care for themselves continues to carry real responsibilities. The difference is that those duties are now held by a person who also holds access to their full evidential record, including the record of cost, of changed desire, of excluded alternatives, and who is therefore making more fully informed decisions about continuation, revision, and the terms of both terms. Duty carried with that kind of awareness is duty in its most honest form. Before you close the index, there is one question worth sitting with. Of all the roles examined in these pages, which one has hidden the most evidence from you? Not the role that seems most dramatic or the one that is easiest to name, but the one where the gap between your actual record and the version the role permits is largest. That gap is the site where the most work remains. It is also, therefore, where the most accurate perception is waiting to be recovered. The role examined in these pages manages what you are permitted to know about your own situation. The next question is about something adjacent but distinct: how permanent arrangements come to govern availability in ways that nobody explicitly designed. When presence becomes expected rather than chosen, when showing up stops being a decision and starts being the only option the situation allows, that is where the next examination belongs. The availability contract examines how temporary presence becomes a permanent agreement that nobody consciously negotiated, and what it costs to remain in an arrangement that was never fully chosen.